public emergency has been declared in the country and curfew has been imposed after countrywide protests over food, fuel and power shortage. The government has imposed a social media blackout in order to curb anti-government protests. A string of ill-thought economic decisions, neck-deep foreign debt, coupled with the pandemic has thrown Sri Lanka into a grave economic turmoil. Times Network Priyank is in Colombo getting us voices of anger and unrest. Here's a report.
All the residents have been protesting here in Colombo. We have come to the outskirts of Colombo. All these residents have come here with tag and all these placards in their hand that go home, Gota. That's a message which is coming out from them. What is the message which you want to give to the government, ma'am?
Enough is enough. Now, we have had it up to this. We are really suffering. I think they cannot do a good job. They should go home. They should just resign and leave us in peace.
बहुत दुख हो रहा है कि हमारी कंट्री ऐसी चल रही है, कहाँ से कहाँ आ गए। बहुत 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 गरीब लोग तो कितने, हम लोग तो कहीं पे भी खाना गैस ले सकते हैं, पर जो गरीब लोग हैं उन लोगों को तो बिल्कुल कुछ है ही नहीं। तो बहुत बहुत दुखदायक स्टेट है। तो रियली हमको पूरी वर्ल्ड से हेल्प चाहिए। ये गवर्नमेंट को बाहर निकालना है। प्रॉपर डेमोक्रेटिक रास्ता चाहिए हमको।
किसी गवर्नमेंट के ऑफिशियल ने आके कहा नहीं कि हमें कैसे चलना चाहिए इस देश में। कोई हमें दिशा निर्देश नहीं मिला है आज तक। हमें सिर्फ सरप्राइजेस मिलते रहते हैं। कभी लाइट काट देते हैं, कभी हमें बोलते हैं डीजल नहीं है। तो हमारी फैक्ट्रियों का और हमारे सारे बिजनेसेस बंद पड़े हुए हैं और हमारे जो वर्कर्स हैं उनके लिए हमने अपने घरों के दरवाजे खोल दिए, लेकिन हमारे पास भी अभी घर में आप चल के देख सकते हैं गैस नहीं है।
This is all our neighborhood people, nobody from outside. And we are protesting peacefully.
And to discuss this issue further, I'm joined by Madhavan Narayanan, who is an economist and senior journalist, as well as Professor Asaganga, who is the strategic advisor. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us and for joining us this evening. I'd like to come to you first, Madhavan. Sri Lanka is in heavy debt. It's in a debt of about 119%. Also, low foreign currency has in fact thrown the entire country into an economic turmoil. Is it too late for Sri Lanka to recover from the situation, and what can it do to tackle it?
Actually, it's important to understand that obviously it's too late in some senses of being, a humanitarian crisis where people do not have food or have a power cuts or a shortage of fuel and all that. But it's never too late to reverse any mess. So from that point of view, something can be done. As you know, India is already extending a couple of $1 billion, and Indian Oil Corporation is rushing some fuel there. But the more important thing is for the government of Sri Lanka to recognize it and assuage the people and not get involved in a crackdown as it seems to be doing. I believe even social media is being banned and emergency is being invoked. So actually, it should be emergency in favor of the people, not emergency against the interests of the people. So these are very legitimate concerns where even the affluent people, do not have electricity to charge their mobiles, and the poor do not have food to eat. There is a shortage of fuel. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis, and therefore the government cannot just sit on its haunches and, or talk about a crackdown. If anything, international help should be immediately sought. And I think the U.S. ambassador has already talked about the fact that you cannot stop democratic protests. So instead of shooting the messengers or cracking down on protesters, they should immediately bring quick relief in the form of food and fuel and others. Long-term implications are there. You have to, for instance, get into a program, let's say, of the IMF or even other foreign investors. Loans can be rescheduled. But what the government has been doing for the past 6 years is just nothing but sort of gambling away the economy. It's like a gambler who just gambles away all the incomes. Sri Lanka is supposed to be an enviable economy, high rate of literacy and fair state of health. Even population is only 22 million. If you look at the size of the island, it's not a very big, the population is not big enough. But they have no concept of food security. And the elite have been very callous and have been using military power to crack down on, let's say, the Tamil separatists. They cracked down earlier decades ago on the leftists. So the government, the country has been left without a meaningful socio-economic discourse. And so there have been a bunch of power-drunk people either fighting each other or collaborating with each other, but that has left the ordinary people in the lurch. So very clearly, India has to play a stern but helpful role. It's very sort of what I call a rope walk diplomacy. I hope it happens, but it's quite clear that this involves a certain kind of a humanitarian issue that involves legitimate intervention by foreign countries, including India and the US.
Right. Madhavan, in fact, just sorry to interrupt you there. I'll come right back, to you on what India can do in this grave economic crisis. But first, I'd like to go across to Professor Asanka Abaya, who's joining us live from Sri Lanka. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. What is your reaction to the way the government has handled the situation, and how are things, in Sri Lanka right now?
Well, the situation is completely out of control. With the social media block from last night, calling the people who was protesting. It was a peaceful protest. They were labeled as extremists. Now, this is the first mistake which the government did. They were not extremists, and there were no extremist elements behind it. The heavy militarization of the government was borne by United Nations Human Rights Council, as well as many international bodies, including India, as well as other countries. You need to reduce the military footprint, but the government kept on ignoring, using national security as the main pretext for all their concerns and issues. So the people are here are suffering. I agree with Narayan, who spoke before me. Emergencies have been used against the people, and it should be used for people, supporting the people at this time. What you have is, I've interviewed few people yesterday. What they're saying is that they are coming out to the street because not to replace somebody or for political cause. They're coming out to chase, the regime. They're angry with the regime. But they're not supporting any other political factions here. They are coming out because of their, the struggle that they're having. They don't have food. They don't have the essentials to live. I'm so sad of what's going on in Sri Lanka right now. You would see the social media block has impacted almost the entire country. And young bloggers been arrested. And so this is very sad. You see a heavy autocratic grip coming into the country, which is a serious danger that I see.
Right, Professor. Also, this is, this is not an overnight, development that has actually landed Sri Lanka into this crisis. This, in fact, has been piling up since 2004. In fact, since the tsunami we saw, where the government focused on public expenditure, it focused on rebuilding, and that's how, over time, it has managed to pile up that debt. So, over these years, in the last 2 decades, were there any early indications of perhaps of this major economic crisis? Could this have been averted if the indications were spotted in time?
Definitely, it would have been averted. But the problem is, in Colombo, they've been debunking this debt trap theory, saying that there is no debt trap. We have only sovereign bonds. We have large scale of sovereign bonds than the Chinese, the loans, which is completely incorrect. The debt trap does not capture the strategic trap. I have been saying for the last 2 years that there is a strategic trap in Sri Lanka on 3 dimensions, which is on the political sphere, where China supports the to alter the political model in Sri Lanka, the democratic model. And the second, on the human rights, you can see the support that China gave to Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council. And Sri Lanka, for the first time, speaking about Xinjiang, the Chinese human rights, which we have never done. So that's the second area. And the third is the military and the surveillance support that China has given. So these are 3 dangerous areas, I would say. I call it the strategic trap. Sri Lanka has been having a large scale of commercial borrowings than concessionary loans. So you can see a rise of concessionary borrowings with high interest rates. Now, recently, China gave $1 billion. $1 billion to settle their own loans. So we don't know the interest rates. These are opaque, they're not transparent, and there's a serious issue that's going on.
Right. So we are seeing, you spoke about China. In fact, talking about other countries, I want to go back to Mr. Narayanan, who's still with me. So I'd like to know from you, being in debt is not new. In fact, there are reports to show that Japan is in debt of about 259%, while Sri Lanka is in 119% debt. But we can see a clear difference. The way Sri Lanka is suffering, Japan hasn't suffered so much. So what is different with Sri Lanka, and how can the world, in fact, right now step in to help Sri Lanka overcome this debt?
Listen, I cannot comment too much on Japan because I'm yet to study the details of that. But, the point is that Japan is in a recession while having global world-class companies performing all over the planet, including building things like the Delhi Metro. They have an economic downturn in terms of a slowdown in growth. They do not have a food crisis. They do not have a fuel crisis. They've got money to lend. Please understand, India's bullet train is being built by Japanese money. Japan has got a growth problem. It doesn't have a scarcity problem. Please understand, this is not just about a few numbers here and there. This is about the fact that if you have a huge loan, it's not a problem if you have a good income that enables you to pay your EMIs. That's how it works for individuals. It's no different from for nations. If your GDP is good and your tax to GDP ratio is good, then you can take on the loans. Now, what is happening in Sri Lanka is that they have cut taxes. Before that, they printed notes, literally, to increase the money supply without having any productive response. So therefore, you've had a flawed fiscal policy, you have had a flawed monetary policy, due to which what has been happening is that the country loses its purchasing power as a whole. So therefore, no, they cannot import. Meanwhile, you already have tea prices collapsing. You also have tourism collapsing for two reasons. One is the pandemic. Then you also had the Easter attack by Muslim extremists on the church. Therefore, they are relying on tea and tourism in the 21st century, which is basically not a great thing to do, particularly because you either need to have fiscal discipline or you need to have use the money that you get from some of these old industries to set up a modern economy. Look at UAE. It doesn't have oil, but it has got a modern financial economy, trading economy. Singapore has used its location to have ports. Sri Lanka did not do anything. They simply let foreigners come and play and please the elite. And the elite became corrupt. But the ordinary people were left in the lurch. And the last straw was a ban on fertilizers led to, so that means even basic food was internally not available in sufficient quantities. So it's a case study in how you can mess up an economy and ignore the ordinary people.
Right.
You can have rich people defaulting. India has had Nirav Modi defaulting on its loans. But Indians aren't really starving, are they? There's an unemployment problem, but there's no starvation problem. So
right.
You have to understand what is food security. Sri Lanka doesn't have, if you want to have a checklist of things, food security, industrial diversification, fiscal discipline, monetary adherence, none of these things have been working in Sri Lanka. And the worst part is that they're using political power to crack down on the poor. This is simply not on. I mean, I don't want to go into the geopolitical aspects of trying to play the Chinese against Americans against India. That's not a very smart thing to do. They are now realizing who's a good friend and who's not a good one.
Absolutely. You rightly pointed out that there have been, in fact, countless slip-ups by the government in terms of policy and decisions that has, inadvertently brought this, dire situation in Sri Lanka. I want to go back to Professor Asanga, who's still with me. Professor, one final word from you. So, while we are seeing there is, a growing chorus for the ouster of the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka, what is, in fact, the government doing right now as an immediate measure to tackle this crisis? Is it seeking external help? And if so, how is it doing that?
Well, the government did speak about going to IMF, the president's statement to the nation. But I think we are really too late because what's happening is, right, we should have gone several months before when we saw the issues rising. The crisis was was getting out of control. So, but at least now they need to take some objective measures, move away from their inward policy prescription, which they have been practicing. This is the reason that they didn't go to IMF. They canceled the Japanese LRT. They changed the Indian East Container Terminal. So the inward policies, they need to get out of that inward policy prescription. So this actually was a policy prescription which came from the ultra-nationalist, the ethos which they took forward. So important that they take very objective measures right now.
Right, Professor, thank you so much. In fact, I'd also like to thank Madhavan Narayanan and Professor Asanga for joining us this evening and sparing your time and sharing your perspective. Appreciated. Meanwhile, Lankans are reeling under extremely distressing times. Social media is blocked and homes have no electricity. There's barely any food at stores, and for those who have supplies at home can barely cook or heat food because of power cuts. Sweltering weather and stinging insects are adding to citizens' misery. Here's a report from one such house that's facing dire times. Take a look.
श्रीलंका की सरकार के खिलाफ जो जंग है वो सड़कों पे नहीं, यहाँ की महिलाएं जो भारतीय मूल की हैं वो अपने घरों में भी जूझ रही हैं। गैस के सिलेंडर खत्म हो चुके हैं। जैसे तैसे देश से आए हमारे जैसे मेहमानों के लिए यहाँ पे चाय बनाई जा रही है। मैम, गैस का क्या पोजीशन है? घर में पाउडर मिल्क से काम चलाना पड़ा है, दूध भी नहीं आ रहा है।
पाउडर मिल्क नहीं है, दूध भी नहीं है। जितना हमको मिला है हमने सुपरमार्केट से लिया है। एक दूसरे की मदद करते हैं, जिसको है वो एक दूसरे को बांटते हैं। बिल्कुल, अगर आज आप सुपरमार्केट में जाओ तो शेल्फ बिल्कुल खाली है। जितना हमारे पास है हम सबको देते हैं, जितना हमारे पास है हम यूज करते हैं।
देख रहा हूँ कि पसीने से लथपथ हो चुके हैं सबको, ह्यूमिडिटी काफी ज्यादा है यहाँ पे। कैसे सर्वाइव कर रहे हैं? लाइट भी नहीं है, एसी यूएसी कुछ नहीं।
यही है कि बस एक होप है, एक हर इंसान के मन में एक होप होता है कि कल कुछ होएगा अच्छा, कल कुछ होएगा अच्छा, लेकिन हमारे लिए लगता है कल अभी आया नहीं है।
ये माइक्रोवेव वगैरह कुछ काम कर पा रहे हैं? कुछ बच्चों के लिए
करंट नहीं है तो कुछ नहीं काम करेगा। लास्ट वीक से हमको 13 घंटा पावर कट रहा है। आज प्रोटेस्ट के कारण गवर्नमेंट ने पावर कट हटाया, अदरवाइज रोज 2 हफ्ते के से पहले हमको रोज पावर कट है 13 घंटा। मेरे घर में एक मम्मी है, एक सास है, 90 इयर्स की है, एक 85 इयर्स की है। उन लोगों का तो बहुत बुरा हाल। हम तो बाहर भी जा सकते हैं, बाहर बैठ सकते हैं, उन लोगों ने उठ सकते हैं, बैठ सकते हैं, मच्छर होते हैं, ये बहुत गर्मी का मौसम होता है, तो बहुत मुश्किल टाइम है। तो हम लोग तो बेसिक चीजें मांग रहे हैं कि पावर दो हमको, गैस दो, इलेक्ट्रिसिटी, और तो कुछ चाहिए नहीं हमको।
यही पशुपेश यहाँ पे हर किसी के दिमाग में बना हुआ है। चीजें महंगी हैं, लाइट नहीं है। कई दशकों से, कई पीढ़ियों से ये परिवार इसी तरीके से यहाँ पे रह रहे हैं, लेकिन अब जो हालात हो चुके हैं उसके बाद इनके पास सड़कों पे उतरने के अलावा कोई भी चारा नहीं बचा है।